Everyone feared him, but money made him believe he could buy anything. The first time I heard his name, it was whispered with a mix of awe and dread, as though speaking it too loudly might somehow draw his gaze. Maxwell Harrington, the man who had turned a modest family business into a billion-dollar empire, the man who commanded boardrooms with an iron grip, the man whose very presence made even the boldest executives sit straighter in their chairs. To most people, he was a legend, the kind of ruthless tycoon you only read about in magazines or see in movies. But to those who worked under him, he was something else entirely. He was a storm disguised as a man. I remember walking into his company headquarters for the first time, and the building itself seemed to carry his aura. It wasn't just glass and steel. It was a monument to ambition, towering over the city like a reminder of how high he had climbed and how far beneath him everyone else remained. The lobby was polished to a gleam, the floors so spotless they reflected the chandeliers above. But the real shine wasn't in the architecture. It was in the fear that hung in the air. Employees moved quickly, their voices hushed, their eyes fixed ahead, as though even a pause might be seen as weakness. And then he appeared. Maxwell Harrington didn't walk. He cut through the room like a blade. Tall, broad-shouldered, every inch of him dressed to perfection. A tailored charcoal suit, shoes polished to a mirror finish, a silk tie that cost more than most people's monthly rent. His hair was silver at the temples but immaculate, his jawline sharp, his eyes cold and piercing. There was something about the way he carried himself that made people instinctively shrink back, as though standing too close might burn them. He didn't greet people when he passed. He didn't have to. His silence was acknowledgement enough. Those who dared to meet his gaze dropped their eyes quickly, their hearts hammering, and those who smiled nervously at him received nothing in return but the faintest curl of his lips, a smirk that seemed to say, "You are beneath me, and you know it." What struck me most wasn't just the way he looked. It was the way the room bent around him. Conversations halted mid-sentence. Laughter died instantly. Even the receptionist's hands stilled over her keyboard. Maxwell Harrington didn't demand attention. He absorbed it. He believed money had given him that right, that power itself bent to his will. His obsession with control was legendary. Every detail of the company, from the shade of the lobby carpet to the terms of multi-million-dollar contracts, had to pass through him. He wasn't the kind of CEO who delegated and trusted his team. He was the kind of man who wanted his fingerprints on every decision, as though the very idea of loosening his grip would unravel the empire he had built. He worked employees to exhaustion, demanded perfection, and dismissed excuses with a single icy glance. The success spoke for itself. Record profits, expanding markets, headlines that hailed him as a genius. But beneath the surface, resentment festered. Employees admired his achievements, yes, but they feared his temper, loathed his arrogance, and mocked him quietly behind closed doors. To them, he was not a leader, but a tyrant, a man who saw people as tools, disposable and replaceable, their value measured only in the numbers they produced. I once overheard two assistants whispering in the cafeteria, their voices low and shaky. "He fired an entire department last week, just like that. Said they were dead weight." Do you think he even remembers their names? No. To him, we're all just numbers. Numbers. That was how Maxwell Harrington saw the world. Success was measured in dollar signs, loyalty was purchased with paychecks, and happiness was a luxury he dismissed as weakness. He believed anything could be bought: respect, love, influence, even time. His home was a sprawling mansion filled with art he didn't care about, cars he barely drove, and rooms he never entered. It wasn't about enjoying them. It was about owning them, about proving to himself and to the world that he had more, always more. And yet, despite the wealth, despite the empire, there was something hollow about him. You could see it in the way he lingered in his office long after everyone else had left. the glow of the city lights reflecting off the glass walls while he stared down at his own reflection. You could hear it in the silence of his words. Calculated, clipped, empty of warmth. And you could feel it in the atmosphere around him, a coldness that not even his billions could disguise. But he didn't see it that way. To him, the world was simple. Winners and losers, strength and weakness, power and irrelevance. He was at the top, and everyone else existed to keep him there. He had convinced himself that money was the ultimate answer, the shield against all vulnerability, the key to bending life itself to his will. It was this belief that made him so feared. It was also the very thing that blinded him, because while Maxwell Harrington thought his empire made him untouchable, he was about to learn a truth he had never considered. But one encounter was about to shake his unshakable world. She appeared so small in his world of power, but her words stopped him cold. The day began like any other in Maxwell Harrington's world. Meetings stacked one after another, contracts to be signed, numbers to be reviewed, decisions to be made. For a man like him, days weren't measured in hours. They were measured in profits. Every handshake was a transaction, every word a negotiation, every pause a calculation. But that afternoon, for the first time in years, his schedule included something unusual, a community event his company had sponsored at the Children's Hospital downtown. Maxwell didn't want to be there. To him, charity events were little, more than publicity stunts, photo opportunities carefully arranged to soften the sharp edges of his reputation. He would stand in front of a camera, shake a few hands, cut a ribbon, and walk away with headlines praising his philanthropy. It wasn't generosity. It was strategy. He arrived in his sleek black car, the kind that drew stares even in a hospital parking lot. His driver opened the door, and Maxwell stepped out, his tailored suit a striking contrast against the simple banners fluttering in the breeze, each one proudly displaying the company's name. Cameras clicked, reporters whispered, and employees straightened their backs nervously. For everyone else, it was a big day. For him, it was just another box to check. Inside the hospital, the air was different. Gone was the polished marble of his corporate tower, replaced by soft pastel walls covered in cheerful drawings. The hum of ambition that followed him in boardrooms was replaced by the quiet beeping of machines, the faint laughter of children, the tired voices of nurses. Maxwell walked down the corridor, his shoes clicking against the linoleum floor, his presence as out of place as a storm cloud in a summer sky. Doctors greeted him with polite smiles, parents whispered thanks, and cameras flashed as he shook hands and posed for photos. He wore his practiced smile, the one that didn't quite reach his eyes but looked good in pictures. His words were rehearsed, his compliments automatic. He was here to perform, not to feel. And then she appeared. She couldn't have been more than 8 years old, a little girl with soft brown hair pulled into 2 uneven braids and eyes far too large for her small face. She wore a faded hospital gown that hung loosely over her frame, her bare feet peeking out from beneath it. She wasn't surrounded by doctors or cameras. She wasn't part of the carefully staged itinerary. She was simply there. At first, Maxwell barely noticed her. He was too busy shaking hands with the hospital director, listening half-heartedly as someone praised his generosity. But then he felt it, that pull, the sensation of being watched. He turned, and their eyes met. For a moment, he froze. Her gaze wasn't like the others. It wasn't fearful like his employees, or calculating like his peers, or admiring like the reporters. Her eyes were calm, steady, unblinking. And for reasons he couldn't explain, they unsettled him. The little girl tilted her head slightly, as though studying him. Then, with the kind of innocent boldness only a child possesses, she walked right up to him. The room seemed to hold its breath as the billionaire CEO, the man who could silence executives with a single glance, was approached by a frail child in a hospital gown. "Are you the man who gave us the new playroom?" she asked softly, her voice small but clear. Maxwell hesitated. He wasn't used to questions like this. Simple, direct, free of hidden agendas. "Yes," he said finally, his voice calm, rehearsed. "That was my company." She nodded slowly, her eyes never leaving his. "Thank you," she said. But there was no awe in her tone, no flattery. It was a thank you spoken as though it was simply the right thing to say. And then came the question. "Do you ever get lonely?" The words hit him harder than any accusation, any insult, any business challenge he had ever faced. He blinked, caught off guard, his carefully constructed mask faltering for the briefest second. Lonely? It was absurd. He was Maxwell Harrington. He had a mansion bigger than most hotels, a fleet of cars, private jets, a calendar full of meetings with the world's most powerful people. He was surrounded by assistants, executives, investors, admirers. Loneliness was for the weak. But when he opened his mouth to respond, nothing came out. The little girl didn't look away. She stood there patiently, waiting, her small hands clasped in front of her. In her eyes, he saw no fear, no greed, no agenda, just curiosity. And in that curiosity was something sharp, something that pierced deeper than any deal he had ever negotiated. He cleared his throat, his voice lower than before. "Why would you ask that?" She shrugged gently. "Because when you smile, it doesn't look happy. It looks tired." The room fell silent. The hospital director shifted awkwardly. The reporters lowered their cameras slightly. No one dared speak. And Maxwell Harrington, the ruthless CEO who had built an empire, who believed money could buy anything, stood frozen by the simple words of a child. For the first time in years, he felt exposed. Not as a billionaire, not as a leader, not as a man of power, but as a human being. And he didn't like it. The girl tilted her head again, her braids swaying. "I think people with too much money forget to play," she said softly. "That's why they look sad, even when they have everything." Maxwell swallowed hard, his throat dry. He wanted to dismiss her words, to laugh, to brush them aside like he did with every critic. But he couldn't. Because deep down, beneath the arrogance, beneath the power, beneath the billions, he knew she was right. Her innocence had stripped away his armor. And in that moment, he realized something terrifying. The question of an 8-year-old girl weighed heavier on him than any business deal he had ever made. Why did her question feel heavier than any business deal he had ever made? Her laughter carried more truth than his millions ever could. The next time Maxwell Harrington saw her, it wasn't part of a carefully staged photo opportunity or a scripted meet and greet. It was in the hospital's small, colorful playroom, the very one his company had sponsored, with his name etched in gold letters above the door. He had stepped in only because the hospital director insisted it would make a wonderful picture for the press. But what he found inside was not a photo op. It was a mirror. The room was alive with color. Walls painted with clouds and trees, tiny tables stacked with crayons and coloring books, toys scattered across the soft mat in the center. Children laughed and played without a care in the world, their joy cutting through the sterile smell of antiseptic that hung in the air. And there she was, the little girl with the braids, her hospital gown now paired with mismatched socks, her face lit up with a grin that didn't belong in a place filled with sickness. Maxwell stood near the doorway, his towering figure almost absurd against the backdrop of stuffed animals and plastic building blocks. His presence, so heavy in the boardroom, seemed almost clumsy here. The cameras flashed behind him, but she ignored them completely. Instead, she looked up at him with that same steady gaze as before, as though she could see right past the tailored suit and into the man himself. "You came back," she said simply. Maxwell adjusted his cufflinks, his usual way of buying time. "Yes. I wanted to see how you liked the playroom." She looked around, then back at him, her eyes sparkling. It's nice, but you don't look like someone who knows how to play." The words slipped from her lips without malice, without hesitation. Just truth. And for some reason, they hit Maxwell harder than any accusation ever had. He forced a small chuckle, the kind he used in interviews when he wanted to appear approachable. "I've been busy. Running a company doesn't leave much time for games." She tilted her head, studying him, then giggled. "That's silly. What's the point of building something big if you forget how to laugh?" The room seemed to still around her words. The cameras flashed, but Maxwell barely noticed. His throat tightened, though he quickly masked it with a dismissive smile. "Money builds more than just buildings," he replied, his voice carrying its usual authority. "It builds security, success, futures." She laughed again, a light, bell-like sound that made his words seem clumsy and heavy. "But it can't build happiness." The statement was so simple, so obvious, yet it lodged in his chest like a thorn. For years, Maxwell had dismissed the phrase as sentimental nonsense, a cliché spoken by people who didn't have enough money to understand its value. But coming from her, an 8-year-old in a hospital gown, it didn't sound like weakness. It sounded like truth. "Money can buy comfort," he countered, his voice sharper now, as though defending himself. "It can buy safety, opportunity, things people need." She nodded innocently, swinging her legs as she sat on the edge of a beanbag chair. "But it can't buy hugs, or friends, or someone who really loves you." Her words disarmed him more than he wanted to admit. He thought of his mansion, silent and empty most nights. The dining room table built for 20 but never set for more than one. The art that hung on his walls, priceless pieces admired by critics but meaningless to him. The echo of his own footsteps in hallways that seemed to grow colder with each passing year. For the first time in his life, Maxwell Harrington didn't have a ready reply. She smiled up at him, her expression mischievous now. "You look like someone who thinks too much about money. Do you ever laugh?" The cameras caught everything. The little girl's boldness, the CEO's hesitation, the way her innocence cut through the armor he had worn for decades. To the reporters, it was a charming photo moment. To Maxwell, it was something else entirely. He crouched slightly, lowering himself closer to her eye level, his voice dropping. "And what makes you think laughter is more important than money?" Her eyes twinkled. "Because when people laugh, they forget they're sick. They forget they're sad. They feel alive. Money can't do that. Only people can." Her words were soft, but they rang in his mind like a bell. He had spent his life believing that power came from wealth, that control came from ownership. But here was a child, frail, vulnerable, yet stronger than him in a way he couldn't understand, telling him that his empire was missing something fundamental. The others in the room didn't notice the shift. They saw only a billionaire entertaining a child. But Maxwell felt it. A crack in the armor he had spent years forging. A doubt he couldn't shake. He forced another smile, trying to brush it off. But inside, the unease grew. He told himself she was just a child, too young to understand the complexities of life, too naive to know the weight of money. And yet her words echoed louder than the applause of shareholders, sharper than the flattery of executives, deeper than the compliments of the media. He stood up slowly, straightening his jacket, his usual confidence faltering. The girl watched him quietly, her head tilted, her braids swaying. And then she giggled again, as though she could see straight through him. That laugh. It wasn't mocking, not really. It was light, innocent, untouched by greed or fear. But to Maxwell, it felt like a challenge, one he couldn't win with money, power, or control. And for the first time in years, he felt something unfamiliar. Not anger, not pride, not victory. Doubt. Why couldn't he shake the feeling that she was right? For the first time, his empire felt small compared to her simple words. The next morning I sat in my office, but for the first time in years, the view from my window didn't give me the same thrill it once did. My tower overlooked the city, the skyline stretching endlessly like a kingdom I had conquered, every building a reminder of my victories. Normally, I would sip my coffee and feel a surge of pride at the thought that none of this would exist without me. But that morning, all I could hear was her voice. Money can't buy happiness. Her words echoed through the silence of my glass office like a song I couldn't turn off. I tried to drown them in numbers, contracts, and reports. I buried myself in spreadsheets, nodded through presentations, but no matter how many millions flashed across the screen, they felt empty. For the first time, I found myself restless in meetings. Normally, I thrived on control, on the sound of my own voice cutting through a boardroom, on the silence that followed when everyone waited for my decision. But that day, I couldn't focus. Every word from my executives blurred into noise. My pen tapped restlessly against the table, my thoughts drifting back to a hospital playroom and a little girl's laughter that had somehow carried more truth than all my years of success. "Sir, do we move forward with the merger?" someone asked. I looked up, realizing I hadn't heard a single detail of the presentation. My voice was sharp, but my hesitation betrayed me. "Yes, fine, do it." They looked at me oddly. They had never seen me distracted before. When the meeting ended, I lingered in the empty boardroom, staring at the polished mahogany table. My reflection looked back at me in its surface, a powerful man in an expensive suit. But all I could think of was the girl's question. "Do you ever get lonely?" Lonely. I had dismissed it at the time, but now it gnawed at me. I thought of my mansion, cavernous and silent, with more rooms than I could ever use. I thought of the long dinners I ate alone at a table set for 20. I thought of the art on my walls, priceless paintings that meant nothing to me, and the cars in my garage I barely remembered to drive. What good was it all if it left me feeling hollow? That night, I went home later than usual. The mansion was dark when I entered, the silence swallowing me whole. I poured myself a glass of whiskey and sat in the living room, surrounded by velvet couches, marble floors, and chandeliers that glittered like stars. It should have felt like success. It should have felt like victory. But all I felt was the weight of emptiness pressing down on me. Her laugh echoed in my mind, light, unburdened, filled with life. And here I was, drowning in wealth, unable to remember the last time I had laughed without calculation, without control. I set my glass down, the sound sharp against the silence. For years, I had believed that my empire was proof of my worth, that power meant happiness, that control meant fulfillment. But one child, with no money, no power, no reason to fear me, had undone that belief in a matter of minutes. And it terrified me. I tried to push it aside. I told myself she was just a child, too innocent to understand the real world. But deep inside, I knew the truth. She had seen something in me that I had spent years hiding. A truth I didn't want to face. I walked through my mansion, past rows of untouched bookshelves, past the grand piano no one ever played, past the endless hallways lined with paintings. Each step echoed with the same question. What if she was right? In my office at home, I stared at my wall of accolades, plaques, awards, newspaper clippings declaring me a genius. They told the world I was successful. But none of them told me I was happy. None of them told me I was fulfilled. I sat at my desk, head in my hands, the silence pressing in. For the first time, I didn't feel like a man in control. I felt like a man trapped in a cage of wealth I had built for myself. And that's when the real crack appeared. Because for the first time in my life, I wondered if I had been wrong. Could it be possible that this child, this little girl with braids and mismatched socks, saw something I, with all my money and power, had missed? Could a child really see something he, with all his power, had missed? He found himself drawn back to her, searching for answers money couldn't buy. The next week, I did something that would have shocked every executive in my company, every investor who believed they knew me, every journalist who thought they had figured out Maxwell Harrington. I went back to the hospital. No cameras, no reporters, no board members tagging along to polish the company's image. Just me, my driver, and a question I couldn't silence. It wasn't scheduled. It wasn't part of a press release or a charity campaign. It was an impulse, though I hated the word. I didn't act on impulses, I calculated. I strategized. But that morning, as I sat in my office staring at reports that suddenly felt meaningless, I couldn't shake her voice, her laugh, her words. Money can't buy happiness. So I called my driver, told my assistant to cancel the rest of my day, and found myself standing once again at the sliding glass doors of the children's hospital. The same pastel walls greeted me, the same faint smell of antiseptic, but without cameras flashing in my face, without handlers whispering in my ear, it all felt different, more human. Nurses rushed past, parents leaned anxiously in waiting areas, children's laughter mixed with cries from down the hall. For the first time, I wasn't a sponsor or a CEO walking in with a spotlight on me. I was just a man looking for something he couldn't name. I found her in the playroom again. She was sitting cross-legged on the floor, her hair still pulled into those uneven braids, a stuffed rabbit tucked under one arm as she colored in a book. Her socks didn't match, one striped, one plain, and the gown she wore seemed 2 sizes too big. She looked up as soon as I entered, and for a moment I froze under the weight of her gaze. "You came back," she said, a small smile forming. I cleared my throat. "Yes, I wanted to see how you were doing." Her smile widened, and she patted the floor beside her. "Then sit." It had been decades since anyone had spoken to me like that, with no fear, no hesitation, no concern for who I was or what I owned. And yet, without thinking, I obeyed. Lowering myself. Onto the mat, I felt absurd. A man in a $1,000 suit sitting cross-legged on a playroom floor surrounded by crayons and toys. But she didn't laugh at me. She just handed me a blue crayon. "Color," she said simply. So I did. For a few minutes we sat in silence, filling in the pages of a coloring book. Her lines strayed outside the borders, bold and free. Mine were careful, precise, almost painfully neat. She looked at my page, then at me, and giggled. "You're scared of making mistakes," she said. The words startled me more than I wanted to admit. "I'm not scared," I replied too quickly. "I just prefer order." She shrugged, her braids bouncing. "Sometimes messy is better. Messy makes it fun." I stared at the page in front of me, at the perfectly colored shapes that suddenly felt lifeless compared to her wild strokes of orange and pink. For years, my life had been a masterpiece of control, every detail curated, every step planned. And yet, sitting next to her, for the first time, I wondered if all I had built was nothing more than neat lines, empty, predictable, lifeless. She set her crayon down and leaned back, hugging her stuffed rabbit. "Do you have a family?" she asked. The question hit me like a stone. "No," I said after a pause, my voice quieter. "Not really, not anymore." She frowned slightly. "That's sad." I looked away, my jaw tightening. I had never allowed myself to dwell on it. Not on the relationships I had let slip away in the pursuit of power. Not on the people I had pushed aside because they didn't fit into my empire. But now, with her eyes on me, I couldn't hide from it. She hugged her rabbit tighter. "Family is important, even when they make you mad, or when you don't agree with them. Because when you're sick or scared, they're the ones who make you feel better." I felt something in my chest shift, something I had buried long ago. For years, I had told myself I didn't need anyone, that money could buy me all the comfort, all the security I would ever need. But hearing her speak, so small yet so certain, made me realize how hollow that belief really was. "Do you ever feel lonely?" I asked suddenly, surprising even myself. She looked at me with those wide eyes, unafraid. "Sometimes." But then I talk to my mom or my dad or even the nurses, and it goes away. Because when you have people who love you, loneliness doesn't stay for long. I swallowed hard, my throat tightening. And if you don't have people? She thought for a moment, then smiled faintly. Then you find them. You make them. Friends can be family too. The simplicity of her answer undid me. I had spent years surrounding myself with people who admired me, obeyed me, feared me, but none of them truly knew me. None of them cared if I was lonely, if I laughed, if I lived beyond the walls of my empire. Her innocence, her confidence, her unshakable belief in things I had, long abandoned. It unnerved me, and yet I couldn't walk away. I found myself speaking words I hadn't spoken in years. I built a company. I have more money than I can ever spend. I have everything people dream about. And yet, sometimes when I go home, it feels like I have nothing at all. She tilted her head, her small hand resting gently on the stuffed rabbit. That's because you're missing the things money can't buy. Her words hit me harder than any boardroom debate, harder than any market loss, harder than any failure I had ever faced. I sat there in silence, staring at the page of half-colored shapes in front of me, wondering how an 8-year-old girl could see through the walls I had built around myself. Walls that had taken years of ambition, arrogance, and control to construct. But brick by brick, word by word, laugh by laugh, she was tearing them down. Was she unknowingly breaking down the walls he had built for years? Life reminded him brutally that money couldn't save everything. The next time I went back to the hospital, something felt wrong the moment I stepped through the doors. The playroom that was usually filled with laughter and chatter was quiet. Too quiet. The toys lay scattered, the crayons abandoned, but the children weren't there. Nurses whispered in the hallway, their faces tight with concern. I searched for her, the little girl who had somehow turned my world upside down, but she wasn't in her usual spot with her rabbit and mismatched socks. For a moment, I panicked. I found one of the nurses and asked where she was. The woman hesitated, glancing at me as though debating whether to tell me. Finally, she sighed. She's having a difficult day. Her condition, it's complicated. She's with the doctors right now. I didn't know what her condition was. I had never asked. Until that moment, I had treated her like some mystery who had appeared in my life simply to question me, to unsettle me, to teach me things I had long forgotten. But now I was forced to face the truth. She wasn't just a child in a playroom. She was a patient in a hospital. The reality hit me like a blow. I waited in the hallway until I saw her again. She looked smaller than ever, her braids undone, her gown loose on her fragile frame. She was pale, her steps slow, her stuffed rabbit clutched tightly in her arms. But when she saw me, she smiled, weak but genuine. "You came back," she whispered. Something inside me cracked. I crouched down so I was eye level with her. "Of course I came back," I said, forcing steadiness into my voice. "How are you feeling?" She shrugged. "Some days are good, some days are bad. Today's just one of the bad ones." The words pierced me. For a man who had built his empire on control, on bending the world to his will, hearing her accept something so unfair with such calmness felt unbearable. "I can help," I blurted, almost desperately. "I'll pay for the best doctors, the best treatments. Whatever it takes, just tell me what you need." Her smile faltered, and she shook her head gently. "It's not about money." Her words struck harder than ever before. Not about money. I had spent my entire life believing there was no such thing. That everything, respect, loyalty, happiness, even love, could be bought if you paid the right price. But here was a child, fragile and sick, telling me that my billions couldn't change what she was facing. "I don't understand," I admitted, my voice quieter. She leaned against the wall for support, still hugging her rabbit. "Money can buy medicine, but it can't make the medicine work. Money can buy a bed, but it can't make me sleep without pain. Money can buy toys, but it can't make someone sit and play with me when I'm scared." Her words were soft, but each one landed like a hammer blow. I wanted to argue. I wanted to tell her that there was nothing money couldn't fix, that I could buy anything in this world if I wanted it badly enough. But the truth was staring me in the face, in the pale color of her cheeks, in the weakness of her steps, in the weight she carried that no child should ever have to bear. I couldn't fix this. The realization hollowed me out. For years, I had lived with the certainty that my wealth was my shield, my weapon, my answer to everything. And yet, standing there in that hospital hallway, I felt more powerless than I ever had in any boardroom battle. My empire meant nothing here. My money was useless against the fragility of life. She reached out, her small hand brushing against mine. "You don't have to fix it," she said softly. "Sometimes people just need you to be there." I swallowed hard, my throat burning. No one had ever spoken to me like that before. Not an employee, not a partner, not even family. And yet, she had stripped away the illusion I had built my entire life upon, with nothing but her honesty. I sat with her for the rest of the afternoon, silent for the most part, just keeping her company while she colored slowly in her book. For once, I didn't feel the urge to control the moment, to fix, to dominate. I just existed with her. And somehow that felt more meaningful than any deal I had ever signed. But when I left the hospital that evening, the question gnawed at me, heavier than anything I had carried before. What good was all my wealth if I couldn't save her? For the first time, the man who could buy anything couldn't fix this. Surrounded by riches, he realized he had never truly lived. That night, I returned to my mansion, but for the first time, it didn't feel like home. Not that it ever truly had. It had always been a trophy, a monument to my victories, a statement to the world that I had won. But now, as I walked through the echoing halls lined with priceless art and glittering chandeliers, it all felt like a museum of emptiness. The silence was deafening. No laughter, no voices, just the sound of my own footsteps bouncing off the marble floors. I passed through room after room, each one more luxurious than the last, each one untouched, unused. A dining room set for 20, though I had never hosted more than a handful of dinners. A library filled with books bound in leather, though I had never read most of them. A grand piano in the corner of the lounge, polished to perfection but never played. And then there were the cars. I walked into the garage, a vast space that could have been mistaken for a showroom. Sleek, black, bright red, metallic silver. Every color, every design, every luxury model lined up in rows, gleaming under the lights. Each one had been purchased as a symbol of success, a way to prove to myself and to others that I had made it. But as I stood there, staring at the collection, I realized how absurd it was. I couldn't drive them all. I barely drove any of them. They weren't cars. They were trophies, empty shells of pride. The girl's words echoed in my mind. Money can't buy hugs, or friends, or someone who really loves you. For years, I had dismissed sentiments like that as weakness. But now, standing in a garage full of cars I never drove, in a mansion full of rooms I never used, I couldn't deny it anymore. She had been right. I had spent my life chasing wealth, believing it was the ultimate prize. I had sacrificed everything for it: family, love, friendships, even my own sense of peace. I thought back to my childhood, to the small, cluttered house I had grown up in. My parents didn't have much, but there had been warmth. My mother's laughter as she cooked dinner. My father's tired smile after a long day at work. Evenings spent together, simple but whole. When had I decided that wasn't enough? I saw flashes of my younger self, hungry for more, desperate to escape the limitations of my small-town life. I told myself I would never struggle the way my parents had, that I would build an empire so vast I would never feel powerless again. And in many ways, I had succeeded. I had built the empire, I had become powerful, I had become untouchable. But in that pursuit, I had stripped away everything that gave life meaning. The mansion, the cars, the art, the empire. None of it had filled the emptiness. None of it had given me what that little girl had shown me in a single smile. Joy. Real joy. I sat down in the grand lounge, the weight of silence pressing on me. I poured myself a drink, but even the burn of whiskey felt hollow. The glass trembled slightly in my hand as I stared into the golden liquid, seeing not success, but sacrifice. I thought of the girl again, her laugh, her confidence, her simple truths. She didn't care about money. She didn't care about titles. She cared about people, about connection, about love. And here I was, a man who had spent his entire life building walls to keep those very things out. It hit me then. My wealth hadn't made me strong. It had made me weak. It had robbed me of the courage to live, to feel, to love. I had built my empire on control, but in doing so, I had lost the only thing worth controlling: myself. The night stretched on, the silence louder with each passing hour. I walked back to my study, where framed newspaper clippings declared me a genius, a visionary, a titan of industry. I used to look at those headlines with pride. Now, they looked back at me like accusations. They praised the empire I had built, but none of them asked the real question: at what cost? I pressed my palms against the desk, staring down at the polished surface. For the first time, I didn't see a CEO. I saw a man who had spent his life chasing shadows, and that terrified me more than anything else. Because what if she was right? What if all along I had been living wrong? What if it was too late to change? Could he change? Or was it too late for him? What she gave him was priceless, and it didn't cost a cent. The next time I saw her, it wasn't in the grand lobby of my building, or at one of the community events where my presence was more about public image than sincerity. No. This time it was in a place stripped of all pretense, a quiet hospital ward. She was sitting up in bed, her legs tucked under a thin blanket, the afternoon sun filtering through the blinds and casting soft lines across her face. In her hands, she clutched a few crayons and a scrap of paper, her tongue peeking out slightly in concentration as she scribbled. The room smelled faintly of disinfectant, but her presence filled it with something warmer, something I couldn't quite name. When she noticed me, her face lit up instantly, as if she had been waiting for me all along. "You came back," she said with a smile so bright it disarmed me completely. I nodded, feeling strangely nervous. "I wanted to see how you were doing." "I'm okay," she said casually, as though her condition wasn't serious, as though the beeping machines beside her bed were no more important than a toy she could set aside at will. Her resilience shook me. It was unlike anything I had ever seen. Then, without hesitation, she held out the paper she had been working on. "This is for you." I took it carefully, unsure of what to expect. On the crumpled sheet was a drawing, 2 stick figures holding hands under a big yellow sun. One was tall, with a square suit drawn in blue crayon. The other was small, with wild hair and a pink dress. Above them, she had written in wobbly letters, "Best friends." My throat tightened instantly. I had been handed countless gifts in my lifetime: gold pens, rare watches, expensive wines, even paintings worth more than some people's homes. But none of them had ever made my chest ache the way that simple crayon drawing did. "You drew this for me?" I asked, my voice quieter than I intended. She nodded proudly. "You looked lonely. Now you're not. See? You have me." The words hit harder than any deal I had ever struck, any empire I had built. You looked lonely. She had seen me in a way no one else ever had. Not as a CEO, not as a man of power, but as someone who was alone. and in her innocence, she had given me something no amount of wealth could ever buy: belonging. I sat down in the chair beside her bed, staring at the drawing like it was worth more than every dollar I had ever earned. For the first time in years, maybe decades, I felt something break open inside me. She reached under her pillow and pulled out something else. A bracelet, made of colorful beads strung together unevenly, some too big, some too small. She slipped it over her tiny wrist, then slid it carefully onto mine. "Now you have to wear it," she said firmly, "because it means you're special." I glanced down at the mismatched beads, their plastic shine a stark contrast to the cufflinks and luxury watches I usually wore. But as it sat on my wrist, I realized it was the most valuable thing I had ever owned. "Why are you giving me this?" I asked, still struggling to understand. "Because you don't smile enough," she said simply. "And when you wear it, you'll remember me. And you'll smile." I laughed softly, though it wasn't the polished, practiced chuckle I often used in boardrooms. This one was real. It rose from a place deep inside me I thought had long been buried. And for the first time, I felt lighter. I leaned back in the chair, watching her as she began coloring another page, humming to herself as if the world outside didn't exist. The machines beeped steadily, the blinds rattled faintly in the breeze, and yet in that small room, everything felt complete. And it was then that I realized something profound. All my life, I had measured value in numbers: profits, assets, shares. I had believed that worth could be calculated, tallied, and displayed in a portfolio. But this child, with her crayons and mismatched bracelet, had just proven me wrong. Value wasn't about numbers. It was about moments. It was about kindness. It was about love. The weight of that truth pressed against me until I could hardly breathe. For the first time in my life, I wasn't thinking about the next deal, the next expansion, the next conquest. I was thinking about her laughter, her drawing, the way she had seen me, not as a CEO, not as a giant, but simply as someone who needed a friend. That was the priceless gift she had given me. And yet, even as I sat there, feeling the walls around my heart begin to crumble, a question gnawed at me, a question I couldn't ignore. Could I hold on to this truth in the world I lived in? My world was ruthless. It thrived on power, manipulation, and control. It rewarded greed and punished vulnerability. And here I was, wearing a plastic bracelet on my wrist like a badge of innocence. I glanced at her again, her small hands moving the crayon across the page, her soft humming filling the silence. And I wondered if I was strong enough to keep this gift alive. But could he truly embrace this new truth in his cutthroat world? When faced with her truth, his pride finally shattered. I had been called many things in my life: visionary, genius, ruthless, unstoppable. Words that fed my ego, words that convinced me I was untouchable. And for years, I had believed them. I had built my empire brick by brick, fueled by ambition, driven by pride. But the moment she looked up at me with those wide, innocent eyes, everything began to crumble. It happened on an afternoon visit. I had brought her flowers, expensive ones, flown in from another country, wrapped in silk. When I handed them to her, expecting her delight, she tilted her head, studying me in a way no adult ever dared. "Why do you always try to give me things that cost money?" she asked. The question caught me off guard. "Because that's how you show someone you care, isn't it?" She shook her head firmly, setting the bouquet aside without hesitation. "No. You show someone you care by being with them, by listening, by smiling, not by buying." Her words landed like a stone in my chest. No board member, no rival CEO, no journalist had ever dared to speak to me like that. And yet, here was a little girl, fragile in health, fearless in spirit, dismantling the very foundation of my identity. "You know," she continued, her voice soft but steady, You always talk like you're the biggest man in the room, like nothing can hurt you. But you look lonely. Lonely people talk loud to hide it." I froze. Lonely. That word pierced me deeper than any insult. For years I had prided myself on control, on strength, on being the man others envied and feared. But this small child had seen, straight through the armor I had spent decades forging. She hadn't been fooled by my tailored suits, my polished shoes, my expensive watch. She had looked past all of it and found the emptiness I had buried even from myself. I tried to respond, but the words caught in my throat. I looked down at the bracelet she had given me, the mismatched beads shining in the dull hospital light, and suddenly it felt heavier than gold. "You don't have to pretend with me," she whispered. "I don't care about how rich you are. I just care if you're nice." And that was the breaking point. I felt something inside me shatter, something I had clung to for so long it had become part of me. My pride. It was pride that had driven me to build my empire. Pride that had kept me from admitting I was wrong. Pride that had convinced me I didn't need anyone. And now, with just a few words, she had torn it all down. For the first time in my life, I bowed my head. I sat down beside her bed, unable to meet her gaze, my chest heavy, my breath uneven. "You're right," I admitted quietly, the words foreign on my tongue. "I've spent my life thinking money could protect me, that it could prove I was worth something. But all it did was make me proud and lonely." Her hand, small and warm, reached for mine. "Then stop being lonely," she said simply. "It's not that hard. Just be kind." Tears threatened my eyes, and I turned slightly, ashamed that she might see. I was a man who had crushed competitors, silenced critics, commanded entire rooms with a single word. And yet here I was, undone by a child's gentle honesty. Word of my visits must have spread, because soon, others began to notice something different about me. My employees whispered that my temper had softened. My assistants noted I no longer barked orders with the same venom. Even the board members, sharp-eyed and suspicious, watched me with confusion as I hesitated before making decisions I once would have forced through without a second thought. I was changing, and they could see it. But more importantly, I could feel it. For the first time, I questioned the man I had become. For the first time, I wondered if winning had actually meant losing. And for the first time, I considered that true power might not lie in dominance, but in humility. Yet with every new realization came the weight of regret. I thought of the people I had stepped over on my way to the top, the friendships I had abandoned, the family I had neglected, the lives I had disrupted in the name of profit. My empire stood tall, but it was built on broken bridges. And now, as I sat holding the hand of a little girl who had given me nothing but honesty and kindness, I felt the question burn in me like fire. Could I undo the mistakes of my past? Or was it already too late? Could he now undo the mistakes of his past? His wealth stayed the same, but his heart was no longer the same man's. The morning after my conversation, with her, I stood in front of my own reflection for a long time. The man in the mirror wore the same tailored suit, the same polished shoes, the same watch worth more than some people's salaries. But for the first time, I realized he wasn't the same man. His eyes looked different, less sharp, less guarded, and perhaps just a little more human. I walked into my office that day and noticed something strange. The silence wasn't as heavy. Usually when I entered, the air tightened, conversations died, and people stiffened in fear. But this time, I didn't storm through the lobby with my usual authority. I nodded at the receptionist. I held the elevator door for 2 assistants. I even said good morning to the janitor, who froze for a second before realizing I was serious. It was small, insignificant, perhaps, but to me it felt monumental. In the past, I had measured my success by how much people respected me, or rather, feared me. But now, As I watched the receptionist's surprised smile and the janitor's quiet nod, I realized I had been measuring the wrong thing. Respect wasn't built on fear. It was built on kindness. Over the next few weeks, I began to change, not just in thought, but in action. I stopped barking orders in meetings. Instead, I listened. Truly listened. When an intern hesitated nervously during a presentation, I didn't cut her off. I asked her to continue, and when she finished, I thanked her for her effort. The relief in her eyes told me more than any profit report ever had. I began to walk the floors of the building, not as a distant ruler checking on his empire, but as a leader willing to understand. I asked employees about their work, their struggles, their ideas. At first, they were hesitant, unsure if it was some kind of test. But slowly, as they realized my questions were genuine, they opened up. For the first time, I saw the company not through spreadsheets and reports, but through people. Real people, with real challenges and real dreams. I started making changes too. Not grand, sweeping ones, but simple, human ones. Better healthcare for the staff, flexible hours for parents, scholarships for interns who couldn't afford school, programs to support mental health, because I knew what it felt like to live with silence that suffocated. And every step of the way, I thought of her. The little girl who had looked at me, not with fear or admiration, but with truth. The girl who had dared to say what no one else would, that I was lonely, arrogant, and blind. The girl who had handed me a drawing and a bracelet, gifts worth more than every contract I had ever signed. One afternoon, I found myself in the cafeteria. Not the private dining room reserved for executives, but the cafeteria where the employees ate. I picked up a tray, stood in line, and ordered the same food as everyone else. At first, the room went quiet, all eyes on me. Whispers spread like wildfire. But then, slowly, people relaxed. Some even smiled. And for the first time, I shared a meal not with investors or partners, but with the very people who kept the company alive every day. The food wasn't gourmet. It was simple. But it was the best meal I had eaten in years, because it wasn't about the food. It was about the company. I began to notice the ripple effect, too. As my behavior shifted, so did the culture around me. Managers who once ruled with arrogance began softening their tone. Employees who had lived in fear began speaking more openly. The atmosphere, once heavy with tension, began to lighten. It amazed me how quickly things could change, not when you demanded it, but when you lived it. At night I returned to my mansion, but it no longer felt like a museum. I stopped walking through its empty halls like a ghost. I invited people over. Old friends I hadn't spoken to in years, distant relatives I had once ignored. I filled those rooms with laughter, conversation, and warmth. The cars in the garage? They stayed. But I no longer looked at them as trophies. Sometimes I even lent them out to employees who had a special event. A wedding, a family trip, a birthday. The joy in their faces was worth more than the satisfaction I used to feel seeing them lined up like soldiers. The art on the walls? It remained. But I started collecting something else alongside it. Drawings. Children's drawings from schools and hospitals my company sponsored. They weren't worth millions, but to me, they were priceless. And always, on my wrist, I wore the mismatched bracelet she had given me. Executives glanced at it in confusion during meetings, but I never explained. I didn't need to. It was my reminder, my anchor, my proof that transformation wasn't about what you wore. It was about what you carried inside. But even as the world around me began to change, even as people looked at me differently, there was one thought I couldn't escape. Would she see this? Would the girl who had shattered my pride and rebuilt my humanity live long enough to witness the man she had helped create? The question haunted me more than any business risk ever had. Deals could be renegotiated. Empires could be rebuilt. But life was fragile. and hers was hanging by a thread. I found myself at the hospital more often than I admitted. Sometimes she was awake, laughing, telling me stories about her day. Sometimes she was too tired, drifting in and out of sleep. But no matter what, I sat there, because it wasn't about what I gave her anymore. It was about what she had given me, a chance to be human again. But would the little girl live long enough to see the man she changed? Her last words to him carried more weight than all his millions. The hospital room was quieter than I had ever heard it before. The beeping machines that usually kept a steady rhythm were slower, softer, as though even they were tired. The blinds were drawn halfway, letting in thin slices of fading sunlight that painted the four walls in muted gold. I sat beside her bed, the bracelet she had given me resting against my wrist, my hands folded tightly as if prayer might change what medicine could not. She was weaker now. Her tiny frame seemed swallowed by the hospital sheets, her voice softer, her movements slower. But when her eyes opened and found mine, there was still a spark. Gentle, unwavering, impossibly strong for someone so small. "You came again," she whispered, her lips curling into the faintest smile. "I wouldn't be anywhere else," I replied, my throat tightening as I forced the words out. She studied me quietly, her gaze sharper than I deserved. Even in her fragility, she looked at me as though she could still see the truth I tried to hide. "You're different now," she said softly. I swallowed hard. "Because of you?" Her small fingers reached weakly for my hand. I took it gently, terrified of hurting her, though she gripped tighter than I expected. "Do you know why I gave you that bracelet?" she asked, her voice trembling like a fragile thread. I nodded, though the truth was I wasn't sure I fully understood. She continued before I could answer. "Because I wanted you to remember. Not me, not the hospital, but to remember that love is the only thing that doesn't break. Money breaks, things break, even people break. But love doesn't." Her words pierced me deeper than any boardroom confrontation ever could. I felt my chest ache, not from pride, not from regret, but from something rawer, fear. Fear that I wouldn't be able to live up to the lesson she had carved into me. I leaned closer, my voice low, heavy. "I don't deserve what you've given me. I spent my life chasing things that didn't matter. And you showed me everything I was blind to. I don't know how to thank you." Her lips curved faintly again. "You don't have to thank me. Just live different. Be kind. Help people. That's how you thank me." Tears threatened to spill from my eyes, but I blinked them back, unwilling to let her see me collapse when she was the one fighting so hard. "Still," my voice cracked when I spoke, "I promise, I'll spend the rest of my life remembering this. Remembering you." She nodded slowly, her eyes fluttering closed for a moment before opening again. "Good. Because you have big hands," she whispered, her tiny fingers tightening around mine. "And big hands should only hold people up, never push them down." That was it. That was the final crack in the armor I had worn all my life. My pride, my arrogance, my empire. It all meant nothing in the face of that simple truth. I bowed my head, pressing her small hand gently against my forehead, my chest trembling with the sobs I had held back for years. "You've changed me," I whispered, my words broken, almost desperate. "You've saved me in a way money never could." Her eyes softened, though her strength was fading. She took a shallow breath, her voice barely audible now. "Then don't forget. Promise me, you won't forget." I lifted my head, meeting her gaze, and in that moment I felt both broken and reborn. "I promise," I said, my voice steady this time, stronger than I thought it could be. "I'll honor you. Always." For a moment, silence wrapped around us, heavy yet strangely comforting. The machines hummed faintly, the sunlight dimmed into evening, and I held her hand as though letting go would undo everything she had given me. Her final words lingered in the air, etched into my soul. "Love doesn't break." I knew then that my life would never be the same. But the question burned in me, heavier than any weight I had carried before. Could I truly honor her lesson? Not just in this room, not just in this moment, but for the rest of my life? Could he honor her lesson for the rest of his life? His greatest legacy wasn't his company. It was the truth she taught him. The day after she was gone, I stood in my office, the very place where I had once ruled like a king. The walls were the same, the desk the same, the view of the city just as vast and commanding. But everything felt different. On my wrist, the mismatched bracelet she had made still rested. The colors had dulled slightly, a bead or two scratched from wear. Yet to me, it was brighter than the city skyline. It was no longer just plastic beads strung together. It was her voice, her laughter, her lesson. That day, I made a decision. My company had always been about power, profits, and dominance. But from that day forward, it would be about something more, something greater, something she had taught me. I began small: scholarships for children in hospitals, donations to families who couldn't afford medical care, programs for employees to spend time volunteering. At first, people were shocked. My board questioned me, investors grumbled, critics doubted. But I didn't care. Because every time they asked why, I looked down at the bracelet on my wrist and remembered, love doesn't break. Slowly, the changes spread. The company that had once been feared began to be admired. Employees worked not out of fear, but out of pride. Communities stopped seeing us as a faceless corporation and began seeing us as partners, supporters, friends. I invested less in skyscrapers and more in schools, less in luxury and more in lives. The empire didn't shrink, it grew, but not in the way it once had. It grew in impact, in meaning, in purpose. Years passed, but her presence never faded. Sometimes, in the middle of a crowded boardroom, I would hear her words echoing in my mind. Big hands should hold people up, never push them down. And I lived by them. People noticed the change in me. Reporters wrote articles calling me a humanitarian CEO, a visionary philanthropist. But they didn't know the truth. They didn't know the name of the little girl who had broken my pride and rebuilt me with kindness. Only I knew, and I carried her story in silence, a flame that burned brighter than all the wealth in the world. One evening, years later, I returned to the hospital where I had first met her. The building had been renovated, expanded, thriving with life and hope, thanks in part to the foundation I had created in her honor. On the wall in the lobby, a plaque bore her name, etched into stone for everyone to see. I stood there for a long time, my fingers brushing the letters, my chest tight with a mix of sorrow and gratitude. She had been just a child, just a patient in a small hospital bed. And yet, she had left behind more than most kings, most leaders, most so-called great men ever could. She had left humanity, and I had made it my mission to ensure her lesson never died. As I walked back to my car, I looked up at the sky. The sun was setting, streaking the horizon with gold and crimson, and for a moment I felt her there, laughing, smiling, reminding me that life was never about the wealth I hoarded, but the love I shared. That was her gift, and it would live on as long as I did. In the end, his empire remained. His wealth, his company, his name, they stayed. But none of it was his greatest legacy. His true legacy was the lesson of a little girl who asked nothing of him but kindness, who gave him nothing money could buy, yet everything he had ever needed. The truth that money can buy comfort, but never love, power, but never peace, success, but never meaning. That truth lived on in every act of kindness he performed, in every life he touched, in every hand he lifted instead of pushed down. Because sometimes the greatest teacher doesn't come from the boardroom, or the university, or the books written by scholars. Sometimes the greatest teacher is a little girl with crayons, a bracelet, and a heart that refuses to break. And though she was gone, What she left behind was more valuable than all the fortunes in the world. She gave him back his humanity. The little girl left behind something greater than money. She gave him humanity. If this story touched your heart, imagine how many more untold truths are waiting to be discovered. Don't just leave with the lesson. Carry it with you and help spread it. Hit the like button if you believe kindness is stronger than wealth, and share this video to remind others of what truly matters. And if you want to hear more powerful stories like this, subscribe now, because the next one may change your life too.